Hello and welcome to Cemetery Saturday with Seaside Shadows. Today is a very special Cemetery Saturday. As you may have noticed, we're not exactly at a cemetery, we're at a church, and you may also notice that you have two hosts for this segment today rather than just one. So you have me, Courtney, here, and also Andrew.
Hey guys.
And together we are going to tell you one of the most fascinating stories today. Where we are located is at the Faith Congregational Church in Hartford, Connecticut. And it's a site established by one of the most notable African-American men in not just Connecticut history, but the country's history. And that man's name is James Wc Pennington. And you quickly probably saw in the beginning, there's a lovely plaque here on the church. It will give you a heads up that he was considered the outstanding minister of this church. This church is marked as one of the notable locations of the Underground Railroad and the first black church in Hartford, Connecticut. So it's an incredibly important place where he served. This is just one of the many chapters of his life, but it's where a lot of influence came and where he was really able to spread his words about abolition as well. But we're here today to tell you about James Pennington from beginning to end, as much as we can about his accomplishments. And lucky for us here at Seaside Shadows, there's been a wonderful article written by Stacy Close for Connecticut Explored. And that's going to help us a lot today. If you're like, hey, you usually memorize these segments, folks. Here's the deal. James did so many amazing things that literally there's not enough room in the human brain to remember them all. So we want to make sure you get the full effect of everything he did. Now, James Pennington was born in 1827. He was an enslaved man when he was born, and he was born into the house of a slave owner who owned just one of his parents. His father lived with a different slave owner. Now, James Pennington did go on to break his chains, but not after he had a really hard upbringing. And his life was actually James Pembroke, after the man that owned him, or that's what the name he was given was. His name, as he gave it to himself, was James Pennington. Now, while his mother and father lived with different slaves owners for many years, his life changed when his mother's owner agreed to purchase his father. Now, okay, you might be thinking they got to live together, but they were both present in a family of slave owners that were not just oppressive, but incredibly abusive to those that they enslaved. And James quickly discovered how bad and brutal that slavery was, including for children. There was an overseer, as there were on many southern plantations and farms. And in Maryland, this overseer was a man named Blackstone. And Blackstone would use this whip for beatings of those that would not obey what they were told. The problem was when James was a child, he saw this whip and he played with it thinking it was a toy, kind of twirling it about. Blackstone saw that he did this, grabbed the whip from him, and gave young James a very severe and cruel beating. And then he beat James further with a piece of hickory wood that he had kept handy. The child sought refuge in the woods for hours, hiding, crying, not understanding what he possibly could have done wrong, because the truth is he hadn't done anything wrong. He continued to watch his parents and others that were on the property continue to be the recipients of such beatings. And finally, when he was 9 years old, the owner decided that he wanted more use out of the child. So he decided that he was going to send him and his brother to learn how to do different trades that they could utilize on the farm: stonemason and blacksmith. James would go on to learn both of these, but be separated from his brother the entire time and have to go on to be a blacksmith at the property for years. We have a thunderstorm rolling in, but we're going to try to hang in there with you, have no fear. So as a blacksmith who had also learned as his trade as a young apprentice, James finished his assigned duties as a mason and transitioned to the blacksmith position for 9 years. He was still brutally treated. Even though he had these trades, he was not getting paid for them. And that's the key thing you need to know. He was put in school as an apprentice so that his owner could get more use of him, thus giving him more opportunity to do wrong and receive any sort of beatings. James had this innate desire to be free of those chains, as many people did. But James, only just about 20 years old, endeavored on his way toward freedom. And he did so after one catalyst. There was a violent beating of his father, who was a shepherd who cared for sheep on the property. And after that violent beating that destroyed all those who lived there, that sent them into pools of tears and sorrow, thinking he may not survive, that is when James decides that he needs to make a run for it, even if on his own. He took a small morsel of bread, any clothes that he had, and struck out for freedom. His goal was to get to Pennsylvania.
On his way there, however, unfortunately, James William Charles Pennington is captured by a small group of white slave hunters. They're looking to return any slaves that have sought freedom to the north. James does something clever, however. He lies to them. He says that he was part of a small group that had been infected with the smallpox disease, and he had ran, and the group had run, so that they would not spread smallpox to everyone around them. Though this may have been clearly untrue, the risk that the disease smallpox posed at the time was not one that the slave hunters were willing to take upon themselves. They let him go. He did eventually make his way into Pennsylvania, where he finds a woman sympathetic to his cause. She claims that she is a devout Christian and has to help him, because that's what a good Christian would do. She informs him that Pennsylvania is a free state and that he would no longer be a slave there. In fact, she had a group of friends, the Quakers, who would not only help him get to freedom, but would educate him along the way. They taught him how to read and write as he made his way further through Pennsylvania to New York, finding further and further freedom as he goes. Through the Quakers, he finds himself in New York. Well, along the way, through his friends in the Underground Railroad and those he met along the way, he found religion, specifically Christianity. It had been through Christianity that many of the abolitionists and activists that had worked to help him along the way had claimed that that was their reason. It was because of their Christianity. It was because of their religion. They had no other choice but to help him. It was what a good Christian would do. He found that he himself found belief in these ideals, in the equality of everyone, in the goodness that Christianity could bring. They had not only set him on his path to religion and freedom, but towards his destiny as well. Through his friends and his religion, he would find teaching, the ministry, and abolitionism. He even renamed himself further at the time, adding the last name Pennington, changing it from Pembroke, freeing himself in name as well. He would befriend local abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison, Simone Jocelyn, and Lewis Tappan, and become a prominent figure himself. 10 years after finding his freedom, he would be ordained, and his dream of joining the ministry would finally be fulfilled. He also was the first black student attending Yale University in their divinity school. However, this was not without caveats. They told him that he could not participate. He must sit in the back. He was allowed to ask no questions and received no work. He was there merely to observe. He would receive no degree from Yale University, and though he was the first black person to attend classes, was not recognized as such until 2016, when they renamed a classroom after him. Still, despite all of the hardships that they tried to put on him at Yale University, he found his education great and was eventually ordained as a minister. His favorite thing by far to do as a minister was perform weddings. It is highly documented that he loved to perform weddings. In fact, in 1838, when fellow abolitionist David Ruggins came to him and informed him of a fugitive who had found love and wanted him specifically to marry them, how could he turn this away? He couldn't. Even though they had no money to provide him for his services, he married the two, Frederick Douglass and Anna Murray.
After the well-known wedding of Frederick Douglass, who was making his way as an abolitionist and spreading his word through places like Connecticut not always the most receiving of Frederick Douglass's messages, and sometimes Connecticut was filled with people who would treat him the worst because they still had deep segregation, and not everyone was free during this time of the abolitionist movement that Pennington had sought freedom. But here he was, an ordained minister, performing these notable weddings. And as the segregation of these communities grew larger and more of the black community grew to be free, they deserved and created their own establishments and governments and churches. Perfect for a minister. And here in Hartford, they established the first black church, and they were in need of a minister. Who better would they try to solicit than the one and only James Pennington, who married Frederick Douglass, who went to Yale Divinity School? Remember, he did not have to attend those classes where he was not treated great. He chose to. You don't want anyone more than that. And what is more representative of your belief than someone like James Pennington? After years of them trying to get James to come to Hartford, he finally decided to move here and become the pastor of this church, the then Talcott Street Church that would become the Faith Congregational Church, and where he served as minister. And they had the man they had been seeking. Now, it was in 1840 that he eventually relocated here, and once he became installed as the minister and reverend here, he took his assistance for his community one step further and became a teacher at a local school for African American children. If you're wondering why, if there was free schools where everyone could go, that he would teach solely at a school for African American children, or that even existed, it existed because the African American community was incredibly concerned about how poorly their children were being treated in the schools where they could go with the other children, with the white children or anyone else. They were not being treated well. They were being treated savagely. So they established their own schools so they could receive an education and be safe while doing so. And of course, James Pennington, who has escaped slavery, who has all these trades under his belt, who has gone to Yale, who has become a minister, he decides he is going to be a teacher at the African American school system in Hartford. Now, after a time, the parents established several African American schools in Hartford, and they were considered North African and South African schools. And the first one was housed right here on Talcott Street, not far from the church, so that he could have his influence everywhere he went. Now, there were some other well-known very early teachers of which he was acquainted and who end up getting Pennington even further involved in his political and social justice movements. And those people are Amos Beeman, Henry Foster, and Ann Plato. They were formidable leaders in the teaching community and in the African American community. And Deacon Mars was a member of the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society. Now, after a while, he convinced Reverend Pennington to join the coalition because he came from experience. And then what happens? Reverend Pennington goes on to serve as one of the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society delegates. And he does so at the Anti-Slavery Convention of the World. And this is in 1840 as well. So he's moving fast when he's taking on all these jobs. Shortly after that, he accepted the group's presidency and continued to teach students, now having moved his teaching to the Elm Street School. He had 8 years as a pastor here, and he even traveled to England, which was amazing at the time, and had 2 years on leave where he built up his studies and educational and cultural history of the African American community. He knew he was part of one of the leaders that was going to bring them forward into a freer and better world. His writings that he did during those years apart in England started to become published, and they were published in a well-known publication called The Colored American, which was an African American newspaper that came out of New York. He would then go on to write other articles and started to have his influence in the community heard throughout the country. Pennington and his wife served as administrators in schools while they continued to write and continued to get published. But then Pennington would write a book that would change history and challenge the founding fathers.
Sorry, technical difficulties.
One moment, please, if you can hear me. We're just fixing Andrew's mic so he can tell you about this amazing book that he goes on to write.
My mic system has been a little bit
we like to blame
today.
the spirits.
In 1841, James William Charles Pennington publishes his book titled Textbook of the Origins and History, etc., etc., of the Colored People. It's commonly believed to be the first ever book about black history in America, and one of the first ever books written and published by a black person in America. It challenged commonly held stereotypes and assumptions about the black community in America. It also laughed and criticized the ridiculousness of the idea of the curse of Ham being a justification for slavery, a common justification used by those in pro-slavery at the time. He also, probably most importantly, responded directly to the then President Thomas Jefferson. He asserted that Thomas Jefferson's opinions of African inferiority were completely wrong and unfounded in science. He would refute those all expertly. It was perhaps not enough for him, though. His book, it went over well, but it was not as popular as he thought it might be. He would continue all the way throughout the writing to speak out and condemn racism, not just slavery. He found the majority of white leaders and citizens in Connecticut at best apathetic, at worst downright hostile. For a time, James William Charles Pennington took his voice to the printed word, not just in book form. He actually founded and established two newspapers, the Northern Star and the Clarksonian. The decline of black news at the time period had prompted his move, the Colored American falling out of favor. And while his friend and fellow abolitionist and activist, William Lloyd Garrison, had had a paper of his own, he knew the importance of many voices, and they were allies, not competitors. He did not just stand against slavery, but against racism, sexism, and all injustices. On September 2nd, 1840, he joined with a group of others to found the Connecticut State Temperance Society.
Now, you may be wondering, while he's doing all of this social justice work, which is just at the beginning, believe it or not, what's going on with his family? As a young man who had to escape slavery after his father was savagely beaten and his family had been beaten for so long, did he just forget about them? They're still enslaved in Maryland. It's actually printed in the Charter Oak, which is a paper that came in Connecticut in the 1800s, a bit of an article about how much he was trying to get his family to be freed as well, and that he had success in getting his father and one of his brothers into a free state. But he did not have success yet with getting his mother and other brothers and sisters freed. It said his owner has ascertained the place of his residence and still claims him as his property. And he, the owner of these people, which is such a strange thing to say, isn't it, was going to come for Pennington. And he was going to come up here to Connecticut. And he thought he was going to get him. But Pennington couldn't spend his time worrying about that every moment, not when there was a crisis to be had. And of course that comes with the ship Amistad. African American and white allies right here in Hartford organized efforts to aid in this, and Pennington was naturally at the forefront of the missionary society that was fighting to fund America freedom fighters' travel back to Sierra Leone. In May 1841, at a public meeting of African Americans, he addressed the concerns about the safe return of the Mendi people to Sierra Leone and the need to send missionaries to Africa. Pennington saw the efforts through and saw it as divinely inspired. He continued to lead prayer services at the Broadway Tabernacle in this effort. And while living in Hartford, he continued to champion the cause of all runaways and for the end to slavery. But what was he to do about the own sufferings that were going on and the fact that he had just made it up here, but he was still told he was not a free man? Well, a friend that he had become acquainted with up here, a Reverend John Hooker, who was also a fellow minister, negotiated his purchase because John Hooker was a white man, the Hooker family well established in Hartford for centuries. And he negotiated his purchase from the Maryland slave owner. That led the next chapter for Pennington to open, where he and friend Amos Beeman, who we mentioned before, were officially allowed to represent Connecticut at the National Convention of Colored People. Pennington was there presenting an argument that people of African descent would collaborate internationally now to improve their economic lives. And he would start what would become a journey that continues to this day. And if you're going to improve your economic life, there are certain rights one must have. And those rights include a certain right to vote.
During his 2 years off that Courtney had referenced before, it had allowed him the chance to travel. And he would go to the Caribbean and the British Islands to find help in the form of financial support to support getting blacks the right to vote. Though he fought against all of slavery, he fought just as hard for the disenfranchised black community of Hartford and America. They were not truly free and equal citizens until they had a voice that would be heard, until they had a vote. They threw the line, "We should not have taxation without representation," back at a country that had just recently fought so hard for just that ideal. On June 25th, 1847, James William Charles Pennington was one of 3 men selected to be part of a corresponding committee with the state legislators on the issue of suffrage. Though they fought as hard as they could and were convincing to many who would have otherwise turned away, the legislature failed them, and they did not pass the bill. Though his initial attempts failed, he was not deterred. He would continue championing for black rights and societal acceptance. In a meeting with fellow ministers and pastors, James William Charles Pennington lambasted and chastised his fellow white men of the cloth for failing to embrace their black pastors and ministers into the brotherhood of ministry. It seemed to have the desired effect. In 1843, he was accepted into the Hartford Central Association, an organization of congregational institution run by ministers. He began to be invited at the time to speak and give at sermons at white churches, more than 10 in total. His popularity and the knowledge of James William Charles Pennington was spreading.
Now we're getting to quite a point of turmoil in the country as we get toward the 1850s. And there's a lot of chaos, and there's a lot of need for James Pennington to be a part of people's lives. And there becomes a church, the First Colored Presbyterian Church in New York, that decides that they require James Pennington for their services, and they asked if he would leave this Talcott Street church and go to New York. Pennington felt such an allegiance here to this church that he refused for a while. But the church members in New York refused to take no for an answer. They knew what they wanted. And what they wanted was a man who fought for his people and who inspired them daily. He eventually took the position in New York with a congregation of more than 400 members, which was 3 times the size of what was this church on Talcott Street. Now, with this move, he got a larger salary, he got to meet more leaders of the abolition movement, increase his membership, and publish more of his narratives. So in a lot of ways, even though he missed this church in Hartford that gave him his inspiration, it was the African American community here in Hartford that inspired him in many ways. He was able to take that a step further by taking what was a promotion. Now, he did go on with the new congregation to further the abolition movement, and unlike the anti-slavery Congregational Church in New England, the Presbyterian Church had close ties to the South, and they had a history of supporting the South. And most of the congregation no longer lived near the church, and they decided to sell the church and pay off its debt. In 1850, the Congress dashed the hopes of Pennington when they didn't pass a new fugitive slave law to allow slave owners to receive help from Northerners any longer. Pennington did not return to Hartford in 1856 for long. He remained there for less than a year. But he goes on during the Civil War to start a very important movement, because now the Civil War is coming in the 1860s. And the Civil War was a war for the freedom that he had spent decades trying to fight for. And now there was a Union army that was assembling. He decided that it was imperative for the black community to fight for the Union army, but they didn't want to until Pennington asked. And he spent years traveling the country and asking the black community to fight for the Union Army and getting them to give their lives to the cause. Now, we are getting quite a bit of rain here, but lucky for us, this church is big and there's a little bit of a covering. So if you follow us to the side, we'll tell you what happens after the Civil War and at the conclusion of James's life.
With the war over, James William Charles Pennington saw an opportunity to bring his message to the South. By establishing or reestablishing ties with the Presbyterian Church down in Florida. Though they were 1,000 miles away from New York and Connecticut, where James William Charles Pennington had made his name and had been well known as an abolitionist, they knew of him down there. His message and his name had reached that far. The reverence that it now held in the black community had reached even the freedmen of Florida. He would continue spreading his message from the presbytery in Florida until his death in 1870, somewhere in Jacksonville. His was and is a powerful voice. He fought not just against the cruel institution of slavery, but for the dignity of humanity.
I'd like to, before I close out today, read to you a letter written from James to his family in 1844 when he was here in Hartford and had begun the establishment of many of his anti-slavery campaigns. He worried for them daily, and he didn't know what to do. He wrote, "Dearly beloved in bonds, about 17 long years have now rolled away since in the providence of Almighty God I left your embraces and set out on a daring adventure in search of freedom. Since that time I have felt most severely the loss of the sun and moon and 11 stars from my social sky. Many a thick cloud of anguish has pressed my brow and sent deep down into my soul the bitter waters of sorrow and consequence. And you have doubtless had your troubles and anxious seasons also about your fugitive star." Beautifully written, but poignant. It makes one want to cry. Now, as the storms roll in, which I think couldn't be more fitting for this particular segment and this particular time, there's a couple things we want to say. This weekend is incredibly important in our segments, and we are honored to share with you the story of James Pennington. And we felt privileged to be able to read about it. One of the first things we noticed, however, was that there is no grave marker and that there is nothing really commemorating James Pennington for years, even though he died in the 1800s. In 2016, Yale did name a classroom after him. We looked everywhere for anything else that there could be, and we're pleased to find that the plaque at the front of this church, which we will show you once more on our way out, does say his name. But look at what we said he did. We said that he escaped enslavement. He goes to Yale Divinity School. He becomes a minister. He learns to read and write. He becomes president of anti-slavery coalitions. He aids the Amistad captives, and he becomes a representative in the abolitionist community and even marries Frederick Douglass. He then goes on to perform several other feats, to including writing and challenging the founding fathers and the notion that black people were somehow not equal to whites. He challenged that firsthand. He did all this and more, and yet the commemoration is minimal. And that does show how black history has been treated. And we here at Seaside Shadows want to be a part of changing that and sharing black stories. We believe everybody draws inspiration from their ancestors and from where they come from. And we hope that no matter where you come from, you draw inspiration from James Pennington. Today, instead of tips, we are asking that you donate to the Black Lives Matter movement and help share the stories of future black people and black people from the past and support their history. So if you are able to do so, that is what we ask today. We are going to take a walk in the thunder, show you the plaque one more time, enjoy the sounds of Hartford in all that it is, and quick hint, we will have a bonus segment coming for you this weekend too.
What an amazing